Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into one of the most massive, mind-bending shifts in modern history. We're going to trace exactly how the United States totally transformed itself. It went from being a staunchly isolationist nation, one that was absolutely determined to avoid foreign entanglements, into a global superpower with a permanent military-industrial complex. It's a pivot that literally redefined the modern world.
Just think about this staggering reality for a second. In a mere 5 years, the U.S. pivoted from outlawing its own involvement in foreign wars by an act of Congress to outproducing the combined military hardware of all the Axis powers. We're going to unpack the true scale of this rapid, frankly unprecedented mobilization and see how it completely rewired the nation's economy and government. So, how did we get there? To make sense of this epic shift, we'll follow a pretty straightforward roadmap today. We'll start with the reluctant entanglement, move into the economic engine, map out the two-front war, and finally look at the atomic dawn. All right, starting with part 1, the reluctant entanglement, from neutrality to Pearl Harbor. Back in the 1930s, the mood in the U.S. was, well, extremely cautious. Following World War I, a Senate committee chaired by Gerald Nye basically concluded that American entry into that conflict had been engineered by bankers and munitions makers. They actually called them the merchants of death. So, to prevent that from ever happening again, Congress passed the strict Neutrality Acts of 1935, 1936, and 1937. These laws explicitly prohibited arms sales and loans to nations at war. The whole idea was that entanglement had to be prevented by law. But, that calculation completely shifted when France fell in 1940 and Britain found itself in a desperately isolated position. Then comes March 1941, and everything flips with the Lend-Lease Act. This law allowed the president to transfer war materials to any nation whose defense he deemed vital to U.S. security. So the pretense of neutrality? Completely out the window. The U.S. started supplying Britain and later the Soviet Union with weapons and food on an absolute massive scale. We're talking about $50 billion in aid. To put that in perspective, that is roughly $750 billion in today's money. With this single act, FDR effectively turned the United States into what he famously called the arsenal of democracy and entered into an undeclared naval war with Germany. But, as you know, the formal declaration of war came from an entirely different direction. The final, devastating blow to isolationism was the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor. It killed 2,403 American servicemen and damaged or destroyed 8 battleships and hundreds of aircraft. FDR declared it a date which will live in infamy. Congress declared war on Japan the very next day, and just days after that, Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S., immediately yanking the Republic into the exact global conflict those Neutrality Acts had been designed to prevent. Okay, moving on to part 2, the economic engine, and how the U.S. actually built this massive arsenal. The sheer physical scale of this industrial mobilization is it's literally mind-blowing. The War Production Board stepped in to coordinate everything. Automobile factories completely retooled to pump out tanks, trucks, and aircraft. Out in California, Kaiser Shipyards became an absolute pioneer, using assembly line techniques to build Liberty ships. They slashed construction time from an agonizing 355 days down to an average of just 42 days. Once, just as a publicity stunt, they actually built an entire ship in 4 days and 15 hours. No way, right? But that is exactly how, by 1944, the U.S. was outproducing all the Axis powers combined. And the numbers back this up. We're talking about an absolute explosion of the gross national product. Measured in constant dollars, the U.S. GNP doubled from $1.1 trillion in 1940 to an immense $2.2 trillion by 1944. The entire productive output of the country was essentially supercharged and laser-focused onto a single, unified goal. Now here is the really wild part. This monumental push achieved a staggering 1.2% unemployment rate by 1944. It accomplished what 7 years of FDR's New Deal could not. Think about it. Back in 1940, unemployment had still been sitting at 14.6%. The war effectively wiped out the Great Depression, restoring full employment almost overnight by putting millions to work in factories and in uniform. But hey, full employment doesn't come cheap. Federal spending absolutely skyrocketed from $9.5 billion in 1940 to a staggering $92.7 billion in 1945. So how did the government pay for it all? Well, it was financed heavily by the sale of war bonds and by aggressive taxation that actually pushed the top income tax rates to an astonishing 94%. Imagine that.
let's jump into part 3. We need to look at how this economic engine fueled a wildly complex two-front war in Europe and the Pacific.
American forces entered the European theater kind of gradually, starting with Operation Torch in North Africa in late 1942, and pushing Axis forces out by the next year. But the decisive, real turning point was D-Day, Operation Overlord, on June 6, 1944. Under General Eisenhower, this became the largest amphibious operation in military history. Roughly 156,000 Allied troops hit the beaches of Normandy. It came at a really heavy cost, about 6,600 American casualties on the very first day alone. But that massive breakout led directly to the liberation of Paris, and eventually the total German surrender on VE Day in May 1945. Over in the Pacific, it was a completely different ballgame. After some early Japanese victories, American forces managed to break Japanese naval codes and ambushed their fleet at the Battle of Midway in June 1942. They sank 4 Japanese fleet carriers, which effectively ended Japan's offensive capabilities. From there, the U.S. kicked off a relentless island-hopping campaign. Instead of attacking every single stronghold, they purposefully bypassed the heavily defended garrisons to grab strategic islands, places like Guadalcanal and Saipan. This allowed U.S. bombers to finally reach the Japanese mainland and severely choke off their supply lines.
But we really have to recognize just how unimaginably bloody this island-hopping campaign was. In just a few months at the Battle of Okinawa, 12,000 Americans died, and 36 ships were sunk. On the other side, an estimated 110,000 Japanese soldiers and 100,000 Okinawan civilians were killed. These devastating casualties painted a deeply grim picture for military planners who were actively trying to project the costs of a full-scale mainland invasion of Japan. Which brings us to our final section, Part 4, The Atomic Dawn, where secret science changed warfare forever.
So, the U.S. was racing to beat Germany to the punch in developing a nuclear weapon. They launched the Manhattan Project in 1942 after getting some early warnings from physicists Leo Szilard and Albert Einstein. Directed by J. Robert Oppenheimer, this highly classified initiative cost roughly $2 billion and employed over 130,000 people. And they were working across completely secret sites in places like New Mexico, Tennessee, and Washington State. This unprecedented scientific mobilization finally culminated in the successful Trinity test in the New Mexico desert in July 1945.
When FDR suddenly passed away, President Harry Truman took over, and he was immediately handed an incredibly grim calculus. Military planners were projecting that a land invasion of Japan would result in hundreds of thousands of American deaths and literally millions of Japanese casualties. Truman had to weigh those horrific projections against deploying the newly tested atomic bombs. He ultimately authorized their use. In August 1945, bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, causing immense, immediate destruction. We're talking 70,000 instant deaths in Hiroshima and 40,000 in Nagasaki. This devastating action led to Japan's immediate surrender on August 15th, ending the war without that land invasion. So what is the big takeaway here? When the dust settled, the United States was fundamentally and permanently changed. The war essentially confirmed Keynesian economics for many people. It proved that massive deficit spending actually could achieve full employment. It also created a newly empowered federal government with an unbelievable capacity to direct industrial output. But most importantly, this massive wartime mobilization didn't just vanish when the troops came home in 1945. It established the permanent foundation for the military-industrial complex. It became a reality so powerful and so entrenched that Eisenhower himself would explicitly warn the nation about it in his farewell address.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this to think about. The United States stepped up. It became the arsenal of democracy, achieved literal industrial miracles, and helped defeat global tyranny. But in doing so, did this massive wartime mobilization simply secure freedom abroad, or did it permanently rewire the very nature of the American Republic at home? Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this incredible transformation and keep asking those big questions.